Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing certain aspects of AI security with my guest, Steve Riley, Field CTO at Netskope. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Eric. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, and great to have you on. We have had many conversations about various aspects of security on a whole set of different topics in various forms.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been kicking around a lot about AI security and the various aspects. And I guess before we get too far into it, I wanted to talk about today was really the aspects of AI security that I think a lot of organizations are wrestling with as they look at how to use what are some of the more outward-facing uses of AI, the Gen AI, the Chat GPT kinds of aspects of AI that are oh so tempting, but potentially oh so risky.
Yeah. I think it's useful if we remind ourselves that these public generative AI apps are just another flavor of a SaaS application.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we think about that, we can say, what aspects of SaaS security apply to Gen AI security? I would argue all of them. And by comparison, I want to draw a distinction between SaaS and IaaS. IaaS, like AWS and GCP and Azure, these days, they're pretty much closed by default. If Eric Hanselman creates an Azure storage blob, then Eric Hanselman's ID is the only one in the access control list. If Eric wants others to see what's in that bucket, Eric, the owner, has to add other identities to the access control list.
And there's that explicit sharing that it has to be done, but that by default, your whatever I've got there isn't visible to the outside world.
That's right, by default. So when you read all these stories about leaky buckets and things like that, someone has changed an access control list. Maybe they give the world read-only, and then, this is the most convenient way to get my data someplace else. I'll just give everybody read-only, and then 20 minutes later, I'll come back and fix it. Well, no. 20 minutes later, you're distracted with something else and you forget to fix it. And then somebody else comes along with tools you can download from GitHub that scrape these bucket spaces looking for open buckets.
But hopefully by default, if I was thoughtful, hopefully I was, that would...
Yeah. You're always thoughtful, Eric.
But at least the starting point is that should be something that's out there in isolation from the rest of the world. And I could dump all of my thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreams, desires into that bucket and intellectual property, and I wouldn't have to worry about anybody actually being able to get access to it unless I'd done something slightly less careful.
Precisely. Now, so with that firmly in our minds, let's compare and contrast to SaaS. SaaS apps, especially the corporate productivity apps with which we are all intimately familiar, they've been built to favor sharing over security. And when you look at the default security configurations of many SaaS apps, they tend to be much more wide open than IaaS is. I experienced that a lot of times when I was at Gartner, chatting with folks, clients, right, during inquiry about how to be secure with SaaS. And either the client had seen this, or I had to remind them that SaaS security requires a lot more work on the part of subscribers than IaaS. I'm curious if you maybe have noticed the same thing.
Indeed. Again, if you take a look at what that general focus of the application happens to be, it is typically one that is collaborative. More often than not,
Bingo.
The back end of the system is also accumulating information about what you've used, what you've done, maintaining that history, and also using that to go build out its future decisions based on what you have done and contrasting those and comparing them with what others have done. So a default sharing focus on that generally.
That's a good way to put it. So if we now have these two sort of notions in our minds, let's go back to this idea that public Gen AI is just another SaaS. we can apply the SaaS security policies that have developed over time to Gen AI too. The shiny new thing doesn't need the shiny new protection thing. And I love this fact that new kinds of SaaS applications, new kinds of ways of using clouds continue to emerge, but don't require yet another reinvestment in a security stack. Someone with a good cloud security stack can safely enable all of these new cool things and not worry about sensitive information flowing where it shouldn't, because they've already got that taken care of.
You're bursting the Gen AI bubble here. AI is special, isn't it?
Oh, is it?
Well, you raise a really good point because, in fact, it is one of those things that we are seeing in that there are a number of Gen AI specific security controls and products and approaches that people are starting to pull together. But, hey, your point, I think, is the really critical one, which is that, you know what? You can actually secure the capabilities we've got with tools you probably have around the house. These are things that all of that input monitoring, all the kinds of things that we've used to manage that flow of information into SaaS apps generally come into play here as well.
Yeah. So, why do we have to think about this? I want to set aside the private subscriptions to Gen AI because they are indeed private. I want to focus on the public since that's what's getting so much attention and use by people in different companies. Remember that every prompt you supply to a Gen AI app and every response you receive, they're all public. These models, for training purposes, they just maintain a history of that entire conversation flow. And here's what happens is that anything gained from, if Alice interacted with this app, then a little bit later, Bob asks a similar question. Well, the Gen AI app is going to use what it encountered in its interaction with Alice and maybe display some of that in Bob's responses. And this is where we see like source code showing up from company A into company B.
Test patterns, all sorts of things.
Yes. The plagiarism that we see in schools. And I'm going to resume teaching at a university here in Seattle. So I'm not quite sure I'm going to handle that just yet.
Yeah, it is. My spouse actually has been wrestling with this problem for a couple semesters already. So yeah,
So let's take a divergence from this for a little bit. You and I have been around for a while. We're old dudes. How was the calculator acknowledged when you were in high school math?
Oh, well, greeted with a certain amount of reluctance, at least to begin with. Of course, it was, hey, anything that could simplify the process. Look at the ability to be able to do complex math on a calculator as this, just the clouds parted, angels sung. This was an amazing thing. My instructors were a little more reticent about how that was actually going to get used and the fact that this was a shortcut around actually learning these things.
I had the same, right? And ultimately, what did the instructors do? They figured out how to assess people in other ways where the calculator becomes an assistant, not a shortcut. And what I hope I can do, I have no clue how to do this, but I think I can figure out. How can I apply that same approach to Gen AI in the classroom? How can I structure my assessment of student progress in a way that whether or not the student chose to use like ChatGPT, for example, I can still gain an appreciation for what the student has learned and use it as a tool, not a shortcut, right?
Well, and I think as with a lot of things in education, it's a matter of doing exactly what you said, which is assessing the understanding and taking a look at ensuring that there is a documentation of process as opposed to just an answer. And
yeah, for sure. I love that. Yeah, documentation of process.
Takes some more work, but it's something that, again, hopefully was under consideration when the course got put together, when the material got generated, that in fact, that was the process piece was the important part. Yeah.
So thank you for the diversion. Always fun to just have these side chats. So let's come back to public Gen AI security. Remember, we talked about buckets being closed by default, where the subscribers have control. And with these public Gen AI apps, the subscribers, they have almost no control. You can disable your account history. Even though you do that, providers will still store and process the data you've given them for some time. Uploaded sensitive information can still be exposed outside the company. And this is not a good idea ever, but especially for heavily regulated industries who always seem to be at most conferences I'm speaking at lately. And these are the ones who display a lot of concern over how to use this stuff securely. They don't want to say no. I'm sensing, and maybe you could tell me whether you see this too, Eric, in your conversations with clients, but I'm sensing that IT orgs, especially security orgs, they want to shift from the department of no to the department of yes, you can, but with conditions. Does that make sense?
There is certainly desire. And I think the challenge with Gen AI is that, like most new technologies, there have been a handful of cautionary tales. And so there's this knee-jerk pullback. And so they're trying to figure out, how do you do this in ways that are in some way manageable? And
well, why don't we talk about that?
I was just going to say,
with your other point.
I'm talking to clients who are looking at all sorts of different ways to be able to manage this, from isolated virtual desktops to all sorts of things to do this. And again, depending upon what your concern is and what the tools that you have at your disposal happen to be, there are a number of different ways you could potentially put this together.
Yeah.
But again, I think to your point, we're better served if we take a step back, figure out what we're actually trying to accomplish, and manage this in ways that make sense. Because, again, getting back to your example, this is something where it's the same kind of controls we want to have in place for other kinds of interactions, where if they're going out to a SaaS app in which they'd be recording meeting notes or doing scheduling, project planning, whatever, using whatever productivity app they happen to have, the thing you want to be careful of is that you are not dumping potentially sensitive information, whether or not that happens to be intellectual property, whether that happens to be personal details.
Customer
information, you
PII.
bet. Yeah, medical information, PII, credit card numbers, all those good things are all things you want to make sure you don't wind up in places where they shouldn't be.
Well, since you asked about ways to do this, let's just talk about something that has kind of been working for me lately in conversations with my customers. And again, I want to bring this back into comparing it to the general practices for how you secure SaaS. And the first is make sure that only the people who need it have access to sensitive information. I know that sounds crazy, and it's like, maybe it's not crazy. Maybe it's like, oh, I've heard this so many times, I know how to do that. But yet, even people with access, they can make mistakes. So I would say start with controlling access to the data that people can supply to generative AI. In other words, just another flavor of the least privilege principle, right?
Making sure that those things that are important to you don't make it out into the wild where they can encounter bad problems, other exposures, and a set of problems that potentially can result from that level of leakage.
Yeah. If someone doesn't have access to sensitive data, they can't upload it by mistake or on purpose to anywhere, including Gen AI. So that's maybe like the
manage at the source.
Manage at the source. Good. The follow-on step then would be to control which public generative AI applications people want to use and what they do within them, right? I would say these days that companies are probably more used to the idea of gating access to various kinds of SaaS applications through different products and markets. CASB is one, SSE is another. So why not do what you've been doing for SaaS security with Gen AI 2 and nominate a handful of the public Gen AI as approved, maybe a few others as tolerated, and then the ones that are really difficult to ascertain the quality of, put those on your block list. But then it isn't just which applications, it's also the activities inside them, right? Not all security tools can look at activity level within a SaaS app, including generative AI. I would say the good tools can, and you might want to look at other contexts. So if this person is interacting with sensitive information and their role is, I don't know, right? It doesn't really matter, it means that they should have access to it under certain circumstances, but not under others. then maybe we could reduce some functionality, right? You could ask ChatGPT generic questions about sensitive information, but you can't ever upload your own company's specific examples for analysis. So no upload, but you can still talk.
It does. You're getting into what I think is one of the more important aspects about what's going to be effective in terms of managing this, which is that our hope and our expectation, when we talk to clients, is that they've already gotten to a point at which they have a set of control capabilities so they can actually look at activities within an app in its various forms. And it is one of those things that it is not uncommon for us to get to a point at which they're looking at much more rudimentary controls. And I think this is one more good example of another point at which there should be a reinforced urgency for getting to a point at which you can actually manage the copy and paste, the upload or not, all of the kinds of things that you'd typically be able to apply if you're working with environments where you've got people who've got information that you don't want to get outside of that protected sphere. And that's, I think, hopefully that baseline, but something that, again, needs to happen to take place. You need to have in place in order to be able to manage that effectively.
So that leads us to our last control objective. Number 3 here would be there's still a role for DLP. But what I like about having this at the bottom of the list instead of at the top of the list is that, and I'm just going to make up a number here, but with the other 2 things that we've already discussed, controlling access to the data itself, controlling which apps people use and the activities within them, we could maybe block greater than 50% of the accidental sensitive data incidents without ever invoking a DLP. But sometimes you need that, right? If a person's access and activity are both permitted, but if the sensitive data itself shouldn't be publicly exposed, then if you got an inline product, that finally the DLP engine can assess the sensitivity level of that. And then based on whatever policy exists for your organization in general, either allow it or block it. Or maybe instead of blocking entirely, we can find something in the middle. And I'm a big fan of this notion of shades of access. And perhaps I would want to remove only the sensitive bits and allow the person to upload the rest of whatever they need to get out of ChatGPT. Or, if your inline product can handle this, have it prompt a coaching message. Is this really something that you want to do? And then the person has to supply some kind of a business justification. But this whole idea of removing the pressure off DLP and putting it at the end has been revelatory for me over the last couple of years. And I think it makes the DLP a lot more useful when it doesn't have to make every decision.
Well, it's an important point because there are so many pieces in that decision tree about, do we allow it, do we not, that you can handle up front. And DLP starts getting into deeper levels of configuration. You've got to start thinking about more specifically policy-intensive decisions around what's it actually looking for, how it's going to identify it, all those different pieces. If you can do the controls that are necessary up front, one, you've simplified the process for management to begin with, and more importantly, you've simplified the policy pieces that are going to be the more complex things to maintain and manage over time. And of course, as with everything, they are going to evolve over time as both your environments change, what you're trying to protect is changing. So those are things that, again, when you need to be specific, hey, do the DLP piece, be specific enough to be able to manage it. But if you can handle this up front with simpler mechanisms and controls, all the better.
Yeah. Like I said at the beginning, this shiny new thing, ChatGPT, doesn't require a shiny new response or a tool. So I think as I've had these conversations with our customers, they're beginning to realize, oh yeah, I can use what I've learned for this latest thing. And they almost seem relieved that they don't have to go buy yet another product for just one function.
Well, because we've gotten into that habit in security, right? We've got so many very specific, functional specific security controls that are out there. And I think there is that sort of knee-jerk expectation about, holy cow, here's one new technology. We're going to have to buy the security control for the new technology. But I think what you've outlined in terms of the way of thinking about this as just it is one more model that is similar to the kind of things that we've done before. And to the extent to which we can use the tools we've already got, manage them in ways that are going to be effective, we've continued to not drive our security teams crazy and make their lives substantially more complex by just simply simplifying where we're heading.
Couldn't agree more.
One of the things when we start thinking about sort of some of these use cases, it's been interesting. One of the things we've seen in a lot of our end user data is that DLP has bumped back up in terms of importance. We take a look at what's security priorities, of course, pendulum swing in various forms or fashion. And it's been interesting to see as we've started to get back into a focus on awareness around data. And some of it seems to be tied to concerns about data sovereignty, some about privacy, some of these other aspects. Mm-hmm. But we're shifting back into a world in which concerns about data are slowly settling back into the front of the queue in terms of priorities. And I think it's one of those things that organizations should also be considering, that bigger picture of data protection, data management. And it serves them well when you get to generative AI and this next stage of what they've actually got to do to be able to manage that most critical data that they're trying to contain.
Yeah, it used to be popular to say that data was the new oil, as in like data has all this wonderful value, and it does. I'm not minimizing that. I like to compare data to air. It expands to fill all available space, and it loves to leak.
The other example I'd also heard, and my listeners have heard me cite this before, is that data is the new uranium. In that it can be tremendously powerful, very valuable if used correctly, but it is potentially hazardous. And if too much of it accumulates, you may have potential problems related to that accumulation. Not sure if it's an awesome. We don't want to go super critical with our data quality here. So.
But can we bury our data waste in a mountain somewhere and just ignore it?
Good question. I think in that same level, it will still be around for tens of thousands of years. So maybe not so much, but yeah, we'll see.
So that would be the exhaust generated when all of us spend way too much time on these social media apps. Huh? Anyway, another topic for another time. I wonder sometimes, I don't ask this question of everybody, but I occasionally do. I say, well, what has sparked your interest in DLP, given the number of failures so many DLP projects experienced in the early, mostly on-premises days? And it's sort of this acknowledgement that data is expanding to fill all space and it likes to leak. And now that we all live in a world of not one data center, but many centers of data, every cloud subscription is a center of data, I think awareness of the spread has become more pervasive and people are more interested in exploring ways to control that. Sometimes I wonder if maybe we should use more words and ask people, what would they find effective for discovering and managing the spread of sensitive information? Now, that's a lot more words than data loss prevention, data leakage protection, whatever you want to call it. But I feel like it's a more accurate descriptor of what we want to do now. We want to find it and manage it.
Well, it gets back to actually was something that was talking about around storage a couple episodes ago about data migration and some of the challenges of, what do you have on-prem? What are you moving into cloudy environments? What do you co-location? The biggest problem, of course, is classification. And we've got this big disconnect between all of that knowledge and the applications that are using the data about what that data is versus the infrastructure that actually manages it, stores it, moves it, deals with it. And organizations would be well served to hopefully get back to that world in which they can do better classification, where whether or not that happens to be any of the tools that can help to push some of that knowledge about the data back into the infrastructure that are there. That seems like one of those paths that we've also got to get better at, and particularly around doing things like the kind of protection we're talking about, being able to understand what those sources of data were and whether or not this data source happens to contain things that are sensitive, or whether or not it's just data that is less sensitive and would be okay to put into something like a generative AI query.
I was just wondering that. Couldn't a company obtain a private instance of something like ChatGPT and then say, hey, here's everything we have. Go classify it. Well, I mean, more detailed in the prompt than that, right? What's the alternative to letting something like ChatGPT begin to apply those labels? It's asking humans to retroactively apply labels to every file they've ever created since they started working for your company.
No problem.
That happened.
Yeah. Talk about scaling issues. We deal with them in so many different ways, but yeah.
We talk about labels like public, private, confidential. I was chatting a little while ago with our actual CTO, not a field CTO, and he's a big fan on tracking a file's origin. The place a file first materialized could convey a lot of information about how that file should be treated. And I've been wondering if that just might be another useful kind of label to attach to documents is their origin, right? Where did they originate?
Well, it's that history.
And then act on that.
Yeah. Well, there were storage startups, ages back that were trying to do some of that were looking at basically group memberships for file creators and things of that nature, trying to go tie that together. But it seemed like they ran into problems just being able to maintain that information in ways that had long-term value. It seemed to be the difficulty. But it seems like something that shouldn't be hard to do, and especially if we're able to go tie some of those, whether it's files, data repositories, what have you, to the applications that use them, what those uses are for. Maybe that's a way to filter some of this information down and then be able to get something that you can turn into policy.
Lots of cool ideas for how to use context in ways that can facilitate very fine-grained access control. And, that's somewhere in the middle, right, between allow all and block all. I think this is maybe one of the best times ever to be in the InfoSec business because there's just so much interesting innovation surrounding what you just observed a few seconds ago is the new animation people have around protecting their data.
Oh, and opportunities in so many different ways. And as we're saying, something that gets borne out, at least in the near-term uses on the Gen AI side. Hopefully we give people some ideas about how they can at least approach this problem in ways that make sense and are actually manageable. This has been great, Steve.
Hey, Eric, I had a lot of fun. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you for all of the insights, but we are at time.
Yes, we are.
That is it for this episode of Next in Tech. I want to thank our audience for staying with us, and thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright and Caitlin Buckley on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about some more end-user data and directional intent with some of what we've been doing around technology demand estimations and our new TDI products and such. Liam Eagle will be back on, and Malav Parak has talked about a lot of our data perspectives. So I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.